So once again, welcome to this dialogue in European Jain Studies on intellectual encounters of the Jains today. We've got another lovely lineup, and we is me from Ghent University and my colleague Marie-Hélène Goris from University of Birmingham and Christopher Miller from Arihanta Institute. So we will get started straight away. Just some minor housekeeping rules. For those joining online, you will see that there is a Q&A box. If during the presentations you think of a really interesting and pertinent question you would like to ask, please start at any time during the talks to type your comments or your questions. We'll get to those by the end of the event, meaning after all the speakers have said their piece. So with that, I'm going to already hand it over to Professor Marie-Hélène Goris, who will introduce our lovely lineup for today.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. Yes, for this session on encounters, it is my great pleasure to introduce of our speakers, and starting with a very dear colleague of mine, Steve Vose, who is assistant professor and holder of the Bhagwan Suparshvanatha, so that means, let me think, the 7th Tirthankara, if I'm not mistaken. So Endowed Chair in Jain Studies in the Department of History at the University of Colorado, Denver. So Steve specializes on the history of Jain communities in Western India, from the early Islamicate period to the present. His work focuses on community formation and on interactions with political powers, and his current research examines the effect of neoliberalism and globalization on transnational Jain communities. His recent book, Reimagining Jainism in Islamic India, Jain Intellectual Culture in the Delhi Sultanate, whose title, I guess, inspired us when coining the title of this very session. He's the recipient of the Edward Dimock Junior Book Prize in the Indian Humanities. So Steve will be hosting this dialogue session, first sharing some framing remarks on the connection between the presentations and then leading the discussions. Then our first speaker, a fellow countryman of mine, will be Jean Arzoumanov. Jean is currently the Ludo and Rosanne Rocher Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Jean is likewise an historian of early modern and modern Persianate intellectual history, and he especially works on textual encounters between Islamicate and Indic cultures. So his comic book will be on the impact of non-Muslim literati in Persian literary production, and all this research led him, for example, to analyze the only known 2 Persian translations of Jain texts dating from 1796. So his other areas of interest include the history of astral sciences in early modern South Asia. And today he will speak about Jati, Sivra, and Sravagi, a survey of Persian descriptions of Jain monastic and lay communities. Last but not least, our second speaker will be Venu Mehta. Venu is assistant professor of Jainism and comparative spiritualities at the Claremont School of Theology. She specializes in Jain regional vernacular, devotional literature, and narratives and practices. Her research delves into Jain Hindu comparative theologies and also spiritualities, and particularly regarding the goddess traditions. Her PhD dissertation investigated the devotion of the Jain goddess Padmavati among the Shvetambar Murtipujak Jains in Gujarat. Venu has many strings to her bow, as her works also explores Jain concepts such as forgiveness and non-attachment, but also Anekantavat and ecology and ethics. Besides, next to South Asian studies, she also holds a PhD in multicultural education and literature, and she authored the book Learn Gujarati, a resource book for global Gujaratis. So today she will be speaking about the narratives of devotion, unveiling the Jain goddess Padmavati in the localized Jain history of Gujarat. And now, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Hélène, and to Christopher Miller and Tina Wekemans and everyone else for making this series possible. I'm very happy to be hosting this session today called Encounters and Thinking about Intellectual Culture. Um, I, yeah, this topic is, of course, central both to my research, but also really is at the heart of kind of my interest as a scholar of South Asian religions, Jainism and otherwise, in that I've always been curious about how traditions see each other. And I think our two papers today, in many ways, are sort of coming at those kinds of questions from different angles. So I'm particularly interested in these two papers and sort of as a little bit of a change of pace here, rather than give some extended remarks here at the beginning, I think what I'd like to do is just keep my remarks very brief, so that way we'll have a response and a little bit longer of a Q&A session. So I just wanted to say, in reading both Jean and Vanu's papers for today, I was really struck by how we're able to sort of see moments in which different traditions outside of what we typically think of as Jainism are viewing Jains and how Jains are responding in those ways. And so, yeah, as Jean's paper starts us off by saying, here's how Europeans and Hindus of various sorts have seen Jains. Here's what we'll see within the Persianate realm of writing. And it's a realm that is not solely written by Muslims, in fact, as we'll see very quickly. And then when it comes to Vanu's paper, of course, we're seeing how a goddess tradition sort of becomes very much central to Jain devotion and Jain praxis. And what we think of as Jainism today really is built around those kinds of devotional practices. And so, yeah, I think the best thing to do now is really just to hand our time over to our speakers. And so we'll start with Jean Arzumanov. Jean?
Hello, good morning, afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Steve, for a lovely introduction, and thank you also to Chris Miller, Marie-Hélène Goris, and Tina Wekemans for organizing this panel. So I will start and share my screen. Which you should be able to see now, if you can confirm. Okay, great. So, and I will start my paper. So from the late 16th century onwards, the Jain doctrine and its adherents became regular subjects in Persian literature produced in India. Persian-speaking authors of various religious backgrounds, Muslim, Zoroastrian, or Hindu, were evidently intrigued by the distinct presence of Jainism within the religious landscape of northern India. These authors often describe the practices of a close-knit community composed of monks and laymen. The most comprehensive account of Jain beliefs and doctrines can be found in the doxographic section of the Ain Akbari by Abul Fazl Alami, the noted vizier of Akbar, who appended this book to his monumental historical account of Akbar's reign. The Ain Akbari describes meticulously India's geography, nature, society, and culture. Its remarkably detailed description of Jainism likely drew from information provided by Jain Shvetambara scholars who frequented the imperial court. It gives extensive information on Jain cosmology, philosophical system, and religious regulations. It also elucidates numerous technical terms and concepts. Despite a sustained interest in the Jain community among Persian-speaking literature, however, these doctrinal aspects of Jainism, which were at the center of Abul Fazl's account, were largely neglected in subsequent works, which focus more on describing the Jain monastic communities. In several regions of North India, such as Rajasthan, Jains were forming part of the Persian-speaking administrative elite of Hindu Rajput kingdoms. However, despite this overwhelming presence and their obvious participation in the world of Persian literacy, none of their writing in Persian remains. There is no ready explanation for this discrepancy. One may wonder about the impact of more recent historiographical biases, which have framed the way in which available sources are mapped and read, and also the little interest on Persian materials on Jains overall. In any case, multilingualism involving Persian and Sanskrit or Persian and vernacular languages was certainly essential in Jain cultural practices at several points in their history, as is shown by multilingual lexicons and multilingual hymns composed by Jain authors in the medieval period. The comparison between Persian texts and European sources is often instructive, as it shows some commonalities in the perceptions of Jains by non-Jains. In particular, the emphasis on nonviolence and protection of all sorts of animals. Whereas, until the end of the 18th century, most of the information in European descriptions come from Gujarat. Persian descriptions, on the other hand, were drawing in information from both Gujarat and North India, especially Rajasthan. Prior to the Mughal period, only two sources in Arabic and Persian appear to describe the Jains. In the Jami al-Tawarikh, the Ilkhanid historian Rashiduddin, 13th-14th centuries, describes Arihant as one of the 6 prophets of the Hindus, along with Maheshwara, Vishnu, Brahma, Nastika, and Shakyamuni. According to Rashiduddin, the Arhanti sect believes that after the appearance of the 24 Arhant, their prophets, the creation will have reached its end. The whole world, men, animals, and plants will be brought to a blessed place and will not return. The Tahqiq Mal-il-Hind of al-Biruni, the famous account by the polymath from Central Asia, has no clear mention of the Jains. However, it describes, alongside other religious groups, a group of Nagna, which means in Sanskrit naked, who are devoted to Arhant. So this is a second source, which probably mentions the Jains before the Mughal period or the Sultanate period. While the word Jaina is widely used in Sanskrit doxographic literature to designate the Jain doctrine, it is rarer. In Persian sources, it appears under the form Jain or Jaini. It is used, for example, by Abul Fazl, is in Ayn Akbari, but does not appear in a very important account, the Mubad's Tabistari Mazahib, despite its very long section on the Jains, on which I will come back later. Mubad was presumably an Indian Zoroastrian, and he is an unnamed source in Persian and South Asian religions for the early modern period and contains numerous accounts collected by Mubad himself amongst North Indian religious communities. In Persian text, Jains are regularly described as being part of the non-Muslim population of India, called in Persian Hunud or Hinduvan. However, their special status vis-à-vis other Indian religions is often noted by Persian-speaking authors who regularly emphasize the hatred manifested by Brahmins towards them. Jains are often associated with the Nastika, that is, the deniers, who deny the divine character and authority of the Veda. In Persian sources, Jains are more commonly identified with the cult of Parshvanatha, the 23rd Tirthankara, than with that of Mahavira, the 24th. Only 19th century texts mention Mahavira as the founder of the text. His idol, however, is never mentioned as being worshipped among the Jains, unlike that of Parshvanatha, which corresponds to the general situation of temples in North India and Gujarat. The Persian terms commonly used to refer to Jain monks are Sivra and Jati. Their difference in usage is often unclear. The first mention of this term Sivra is found in Shamsuddin Afif's History of the Reign of Firuz Shah, 14th century, as Steve Vose showed. The Indian vernacular term Sivra, often transcribed in 19th century Persian texts with the cerebral R, might be derived from Shvetapata or Shvetambar, both of which are Sanskrit terms for Shvetambara monks. Another possible etymology would be the Sanskrit Chivara, dress of a Buddhist or Jain monk, as suggested by Turner. In Indian languages, the term yati refers to any type of ascetic and came in the recent centuries to refer, among the Shvetambara, to a semi-domesticated mendicant, sometimes a cleric and ritual specialist who lives in a temple and who does not have the life of an itinerant sadhu. Both words, that is, Sevra and Jati, appear regularly in the vernacular literature in the form of Sevra and Jati and refer indistinctly to Shvetambara monks. Jati are often found in pre-modern Rajasthani judicial records. It is also used by Pritinath, a 16th century Nat, and Rajab, a 17th century Dadupanti, in their fierce attacks directed at Jain monks and laymen. In the Persian texts, it is not always clear if the term yadi is intended in its more recent restricted meaning, or in the historical meaning of religious renouncer. The terms Sivra and Jati appear in almost all the Persian texts that I've been surveying. Sivra is more even precisely transcribed as Sevara by Abul Fazl, and Sevra with a cerebral R by Mizakatil, a early 19th century poet and scholar who was always very precise in the way he was transliterating Indic words in his Persian works. In the Ain Akbari, just before explaining the chronological Jain conceptions, Abul Faz passes a very positive judgment on the Sivra. The group of the Sivra, who are distinguished by their austerity, asceticism, and wisdom in all parts of India. The term Sivra also appears in several sources in the modified form Sarivra, the origin of the modification being unclear. The great Tapagacha monk Hiravijaya Suri, who was present at the Mughal court, is referred as a Sivra in a Mughal farman of 1590. But despite these elements, we see that Sivra and Jati seem often to be used only marginally differentially by certain authors, and the difference in usage is non-consistent. So it's quite difficult to reconstruct the exact meaning of these two words, Sivra and Jati. The division of the Jain community into monks and laity is mentioned explicitly in most sources. The Ain Akbari distinguishes between renunciants and laymen, a division echoed by Mubad in his Dabestani Mazahib in the mid-17th century. Generally speaking, the laity is called in Persian Sravak or Sravagi, from the Sanskrit Shravaka. In vernacular satirical text, these terms are also used to refer to Jain merchants. To the Persian writers, the Jains as a whole thus appear to form a coherent community consisting in both monks and laymen. In Persian text, this separation between monks and laity does not seem as structuring when we look at other descriptions of Hindu religious communities where this relation between the monks and laymen is not underlined. This relation between Jain monks and laity is generally described by authors as revolving around the gift of food by the laity to mendicant monks. The laity is regularly described as belonging to the Banya caste, and a few texts offer detailed descriptions of the Banya caste and their subcastes. The rule of monastic and lay life are described in further detail by Abul Fazl and also in James Skinner, Tashilak Fam, much later. So James Skinner was a brilliant Anglo-Indian military officer who composed an exceptional ethnographic study in Persian of Indian caste and religious practitioners in 1825. And it's quite an important source, early 19th century source, in order to understand the Jain monastic communities. The division of Jain communities into Shvetambara and Digambara is rarely mentioned by our authors. Overall, Digambara monks are little described in the earlier Persian sources. Despite the presence of several Digambara monastic groups in the imperial capital of Agra, Abul Fazl admits that he had the greatest difficulty in obtaining information about the Digambara, despite having had several encounters with Shvetambara monks. About the Digambara, he explained that their descriptions was written as if behind a veil. The nudity of monks, a feature the characteristic of Digambara monks, is almost never mentioned. An exception being Abul Fazl, who, as we said, doesn't seem to have ever encountered a Digambara monk. In reality, we know that maybe naked monks were rarer than earlier sources might indicate, as the 19th century example tells us. We have a rare example in the Persian sources of mention of a nudity of a Digambara by the 18th century Hindu poet Afarin, who describes in very poetic term the nudity of a Digambara. But this is an exception, and also it should be taken with caution since the word did not necessarily refer to a Jain monk, but just to a naked ascetic. Notably, illustrations in 19th century Persian ethnographic manuals do not feature naked Digambara monks. Here is an example of a painting in a manuscript for 1812 ethnographic survey composed by Brahmin Benares, and that has a division of the community between Shvetambara and Digambara. Here we see in the top left corner is a Shvetambara, and top right corner is the Digambara, as the Persian captions indicate. The specific sectarian divisions within the Shvetambara and Digambara communities are actually rarely discussed. Also, more specific, for example, the division of the Shvetambara into different sectarian groups, such as the Gachas, are seldom found. We find, as an exception, mentioned by Jahangir is in Jahangir Nama, the mention of the Tapa and Kartara Gacha. In his Siraj al-Lughat, the famous 18th century Persian lexicographer Arezu explains that the Jain community is divided into 84 groups. This is one of the earlier reference to a mention of a division within Jain monastic community. Here is probably referring to the canonical but probably fictitious division of the Shvetambara into 84 gachas. So this is the first mention of this number, and we found a much more detailed account of this gacha division in the Mirat-e-Ahmadi. So the Mirat-e-Ahmadis is one of the most important sources on the history of Gujarat in the Mughal period. Its author, Ali Muhammad Khan, was a Mughal official in Gujarat active in the mid-18th century. The originality of his work lies in the addition, after the historical part, of an appendix containing statistical, geographical, and ethnographic information on Gujarat, and his information on Jains and Banya is some of the most important in the pre-colonial Persian sources. The Shvetambara monastic community today is mainly divided between the Multipujaka and the Stanagbasi, the former practicing image worship, the latter rejecting it. The Terapant, a third Shvetambara group separated from the Stanagvasi in the 1760s, is the third larger group numerically among the Shvetambara. Mubad in the Dabestani Mazahib, so a text composed in the mid-17th century, is the first to describe the division between Multipujaka and Stanagvasi. He said, "The Lungi worship only God in solitude and regard him as devoid of any defects and imperfection, and as devoid of incarnation or unity. They do not worship an idol. The Pujari worship idols and have temples." Here, the Lungi referred to by Mubad most likely correspond to the Lonka Gacha. This movement, founding in the 15th century by Lonka Shah, partially rejected the worship of images. The Stanagvasi split from the Lonka Gacha in the first half of the 17th century came by the rejection of a relaxation of practices concerning image worship. Again, in the text by Mubad, the term Pujari, which usually refers to religious specialists, often non-Jains, active in Multipujaka temples, here is not clear. Mubad's definition seems to correspond more to Multipujakas. So here is a bit of an interesting usage of the word Pujari in this passage by Mubad. In another passage, Mubad also describes the Mahatma, who, quote, accumulate money, eat in their own houses, consume cold water, and may marry, unquote. This description by Mubad seems to fit the Shvetambara Yetis, a group of domesticated monks. The Stanagvasi are regularly called Dundia in the vernacular sources between the 20th century, They are characterized by constantly wearing a cloth over their mouths to prevent them from inadvertently killing living beings with their breath. This characteristic seems to have been of particular interest to observers, and depictions of the Dundia are numerous from the 19th century onward. The Mirat Ahmadi describes them thus: a sect amongst them, which they call Dundia, does not believe in the worship of images. Again, later, Maturanath, writing in 1812, divides the Shvetambara into Samvegi and Dundia. So, but Maturanath, whom I mentioned earlier, was a Brahmin trained in the Sanskrit sciences, who served as a librarian in the Benares Sanskrit College, and he is the author of an ethnographic companion composed for a British officer. Many of his descriptions of Indian sects were taken up by Horace Hayman Wilson in his description of Indian religious groups, and were quite influential in the way Jains were depicted in the 19th century colonial sources. So in his Riyaza Mazahib, or Gardens of Religions, the Samvegi seem to correspond to mendicant monks among the Murtipujaka, who were historically opposed to the domesticated Yati. One may wonder whether Maturanath really encountered these Samvegi monks due to their apparent variety before the late 19th century in comparison to the domesticated Yati. So this is for Murtipujaka and Snagvasi. And concerning the Gambara, they are often left out of Persian sources, as is the case with European sources. Maturanath, so again this Benares Brahmin from the early 19th century, was nevertheless aware of their division into two main groups, the Bispants and the Terapant. He explains with some accuracy that the authority of the masters prevails amongst the Bispant, while that of the Shastra prevails amongst the Terapant. Persian texts rarely give any information about the tradition of naked mendicant monks in the Digambara order, so the so-called Munis. According to the Tashil al-Akfam, this ethnographical text composed by James Skinner in 1825, in our time, this category of ascetics is not found. So this is what someone living in Haryana says about the Munis. However, the Bhattaraka, the Digambara domesticated monks, are accurately described by him. Sorry, that was a very poor transition. I was done with my sentence. So, moving on. Most Persian texts on Jains interestingly dwell on the hatred of Brahmins and more generally Hindus towards Jains. At the end of his chapter on the Jains, Abul Faz states that due to Emperor Akbar's benevolent influence, the aversion between the religions has dissipated in favor of universal conciliation. In this passage, Abul Faz tells an anecdote to illustrate this enmity. A Brahman confronted with a raging elephant on one side and a Jain monk on the other would always choose the elephant, despite the danger. Strikingly, this image is repeated in several texts written by Hindus and Muslims. And besides this interesting anecdote, Jains are often generally associated with materialism and with Nastika sects. How much more do I have? Sorry.
Jain, you have about 2 minutes left.
Okay. So they are associated with the Nastika, who, according to Sanskrit doxography, do not recognize the divine nature of the Veda. So Sujan Rai Bandari, for example, in his Khulasat al-Tawarikh, which was composed in the 17th century and is represents a massive change in the use of Persian by Hindu literati to compose history, and so is a game changer in the historiographical genre in South Asia. In this text, Sujan Rai Bandari describes various Indian religious groups, amongst them the Jains, who are depicted very negatively. He attributes, for example, to Jain theologians the belief that men are born and die spontaneously without a first cause in the same way that grass grows by itself. What is very striking in this account is this image is actually already found in Rashiduddin in the 14th century, who attributes this to the Nastika sect, which was described after the Jains by Rashiduddin. Some authors, such as Sujan Rai Bandari and others, also attribute to the Jains a total disregard for elementary moral rules, since they do not consider themselves to divine judgment. So, because of their being materialists. Jahangir, for example, described Jain temples as dens of corruption when the Banya send their wives and daughters to the Sivra. Shame and modesty are absent from there, and all kinds of corruptions and impurities are committed. Later in the Guzai Hal, this early 17th century translation of the Prabhudas Chandrodaya of Krishna Mishra, Chanak, who represent the Jain doctrine, encourages his followers to offer the enjoyment of their wives to the jati they meet. So this element was, of course, already found in the original Sanskrit text, but probably this popular translation in Persian contributed to spreading these false perceptions of Jains of Sivra partaking their laymen's, their devotees' wives.
Jean, you probably should wrap up now. Thank you.
Yep. Well, so a few remarks to end is what I found quite interesting in those description of Jains is the continuous mention of Jains as practitioners of occult scientific practices, and visibly were renowned amongst North Indian communities as excellent astrologers and snake charmers. And so this association between Jains and snakes, which appears in several of their histories that are reported by different of our authors between the 17th century and the 19th century, I think is worth some more research, and I would love to look at more sources on Jain occult sciences to relate with these narratives that are found in Persian sources. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for this quick end to my talk.
Thank you very much for that, Jean. Fascinating content, and I'm really happy to have a second crack at it for after the last talk that you gave a few months ago. And now I think we should switch over to our second speaker here, Venu Mehta. If we could.
Yeah, sure. Jacques, will you allow me to share the screen? If you can stop sharing yours. Yeah. Thank you. Jai Jinendra, good morning, good afternoon, evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today to discuss the Jain goddess Padmavati and the select narratives that have developed around her within the localized Jain history of Gujarat. My focus is on how these narratives, originating in the medieval Sanskrit and Prakrit Jain literature, such as Jina Prabhasuri's Vividatirtha Kalpa and Dhaneshwar Suri's Satrunjay Mahatmya, have been extended and circulated through oral traditions among the Shvetambara Murti Pujak Jains of Gujarat. Jin Prabh's Vividatirtha Kalpa is composed in the early 14th century, and scholars generally place Dhaneshwar's Shatrunjay Mahatmya composition between 11th and 14th century CE, although the text itself claims that it was written in 421 CE in Vallabhi. I will highlight how these narratives function as a means for devotees to interact with the goddess Padmavati, and how they have been integrated into devotional practices towards her. Also, I will argue that in the contemporary times, Jains consider this narrative to be instrumental in construction of the goddess Padmavati within their localized religious history. Jain universal history refers to the legendary history of the world as understood in the Jain tradition, focusing on the life accounts of the 63 illustrious men, or Shalaka Purusha, who are believed to be born in different locations of Madhyaloka and during the current life cycle of time. In contrast, localized Jain history is more grounded in identifiable historical context of India, emphasizing the regional and historical development of the Jain communities, temples, practices, and in this case, even devotional practices and identity of the goddess. I draw upon my recent fieldwork among the Jains in Gujarat and textual research to present this discussion. Like all attendant deities, Padmavati is depicted with distinct attributes and amount. In her representation, she is easily recognizable by the serpent hoods over her head, and from her association with the Jina Parshvanath and with her consort Yaksha Dharnendra, who is the male attendant deity of the Jina. And in the case of Gujarat, you will often see even the Parshva Yaksha, as you can see here. Both the Shwetambar and the Digambar traditions provide the composite form of Kurkut Sarpa or cock snake or just cock as the mount of Padmavati, and a noose, gourd, lotus as her main attributes. However, she is also portrayed sitting on a full-blown lotus or a swan. In contemporary Jain sculptures or poster art, Padmavati is frequently portrayed with all three mounts, as you can see on the right, swan, lotus, and Kurkut Sarpa. Moreover, Padmavati is also described in red, white, and golden complexion most of the time. Much of the available textual, inscriptional, and archaeological evidence concerning Padmavati originates from the southern regions of India and has been focus of scholarly interest. I had noticed that relatively very little scholarly attention has been given to how Padmavati has been conceptualized and integrated into the Jain traditions of Gujarat, as the Jain textual tradition has acknowledged her traditional role as a Yakshi or Shashan Devta. The Jains conceptualizing her as a great goddess or feminine divine, seemingly present a theological paradox within Jainism. Padmavati's presence in Jain literary works of Gujarat began in 11th and 12th centuries. Her popularity grew in the 12th century through her legendary connection to Sri Shankheshwara Parshvanath Tirth, as described in Dhaneshwar Suri's Shatrunjay Mahatmya and Jain Prabhu Suri's Vivid Tirtha Kalpa. These narratives linking the goddess to the temple shaped her regional and religious significance and spread through devotional literature and practices. Her influence extended further in the 16th century with the Harsha Sagar's Gujarati composition, and I have put it in the second slide, and in the 18th century through accounts on a Jain mendicant and author Pandit Veer Vijay. Veer Vijay's special relationship with her, including a few particular miraculous incidents, and later through devotional songs and lay author text fostering Aradhana tradition. This evolution made her more accessible to lay Gujarati Jains while aligning her with the Jain cosmology and theology. The veneration of Padmavati presents a unique case within Jain devotion. While Jains are traditionally regarded as Jinas are regarded as the only worthy object of worship, the Shwetambara Murti Pujak Jains of Gujarat have constructed a space for Padmavati within their devotional landscape. Through textual, oral, and devotional practices, Padmavati has evolved from her role as Sashan Devta, or guardian deity of 23rd Jina Parshvanath, into a more central figure of devotion. One of the aspects of the devotion to Padmavati is reflected in the ways in which Shwetambar Jains have integrated the goddess into their localized religious history, particularly in Gujarat, where her presence intersects with the broader framework of the Jain universal history. One prominent example is the narrative of the Sri Shankheshwara Parshvanath Tirtha, located in Shankheshwar town of Patan district in the state of Gujarat. It's not permitted to take pictures inside the temple. So it's like the rear door. And the other painting that you see here is as the cover page of a Gujarati book that describes the beginning of the temple. So this temple is located in the Shankheshwara town of Patan district in the state of Gujarat, where Padmavati is credited with not only safeguarding, but playing a central role in the installing of the miraculous image of Parshvanath. This event recorded in Dhaneshwar Sudit Shatrunjay Mahatmya can be summarized this way. Padmavati originally worshipped the miraculous image of Parshvanath alongside her consort Dhanendra in Devaloka. This image was sought by Krishna during his battle against Magadha king Jarasandha. Facing a dire situation, Krishna sought counsel from his cousin Neminath, the 22nd Jina, who advised him to obtain and worship the image of Parshvanath to heal his ailing army. Krishna then performed a 3-day penance, invoking Padmavati's presence. Padmavati, moved by Krishna's devotion, initially offered to resolve his conflict through her divine powers in seconds, but ultimately granted him the sacred image upon his insistence. Krishna, after successfully using the ablution water from the image to revive his army, later installed the Pratima or image at Sankeshwara. This particular Sthala Purana, or the official account of Sankeshwar Parshvanath Tirtha, tells us the legendary story of Padmavati's connection to the localized Jain religious history in Gujarat. While the Tirtha is primarily associated with the veneration of Jain Parshvanath, through oral traditions, the narrative positioning Padmavati as a crucial figure in its history have been popularly remains part of collective memory of the Jains in Gujarat. These accounts emphasize her divine intervention in securing and installing the image of Parshvanath, making her an integral part of the sacred landscape of Gujarat. Like this Thal Purana of Shankeshwar Parshvanath Tirtha, the narrative describing Padmavati's role in origin of Jina holds significant relevance. The legendary account of the origin of an image is referred to as Utpatti of a Pratima, origin of the image, in the Gujarati language, a common term among the Jains in Gujarat who I interacted with. One such narrative is recorded in the Sri Parshvanath Kalpa, along with Stambhaka Kalpa of Jain Prabhasuri's Vivid Tirtha Kalpa. Jain Prabhasuri's inclusion of Padmavati in the story of the Jina's image's origin present a variation from her role in the legend of Sankeshwara Parshvanath Tirtha, although it eventually connects. The Kalpa, consisting of 74 verses, narrates the journey of a miraculous image of Parshvanath through different realms and historical figures. This image, known for its protecting powers, was initially worshipped by the celestial being and mortal alike. Indra, the king of gods, venerated this image and later gave it to Rama and Sita, the characters from the Hindu religion traditions, who worshipped it during their exile in Dandakaranya forest. Eventually, Indra reclaimed the image and kept it in his celestial place for over 1 million years. During Krishna's reign, Indra, through his divine charioteer Matli, sent the image to him to aid in the battle against Jarasandha. Following Neminath's advice, Krishna performed ritual worship of the Jina Parshvanath using the ablution water to heal his ailing army. Upon victory, Krishna established a temple in Sankeshwara and installed a replica of the image there while taking the original to Dwarka, where he continued its worship for 700 years. When Dwarka was eventually submerged, and the image remained protected within its temple beneath the sea. So now the temple is beneath the sea. Here comes Devi Padmavati. The narrative continues with the Naga king, Dakshaka, retrieving and venerating the image for 80,000 years. During the time of Mahavira, a merchant named Dhaneshwar, while traveling by sea, was instructed by Padmavati to recover the image, submerge under the water in the ocean. With her assistant, Dhaneshwar retrieved the image and installed it in a Jain temple in his hometown. And literally in the text, Padmavati says that you sit on my back and swim through the underwater. Over centuries, the sacred image changed hands and locations, and eventually reaching Stambhaka, modern Kambe or Kambhat in the state of Gujarat, where it was installed by Abhay Devasuri, a Jain mendicant under Yaksha Dharmendra's guidance. This narrative not only places Padmavati in a central role, but also showcases how she actively connects her to the framework of the Jain universal history with different historical and mythological figures, ensuring the image's continued veneration across time and space. However, for Shwetambar Murti Pujak Jains of Gujarat, the inclusion of Padmavati in this legend even particularly, reinforces her significance in the localized history of the Jains in Gujarat. A similar narrative with a slight variation is also found in Pandava Charitam, biography of Pandava of Deva Vijay Gani, the text which follows the theme of the Jain Mahabharata. It was composed in Sanskrit in 1603 and consists of 18 cantos. The canto 13 includes the story of the war between Krishna and Jarasandha. The narrative of Padmavati giving the image of Jina Parshvanath repeats in the same fashion as it was described by Dhaneshwar Suri. The only difference from Deva Vijay Gani's work is that in this narrative, Krishna observes penance to invoke Dharnendra instead of Padmavati. But then after, Padmavati gives the image to Krishna upon instruction of Dharnendra. However, the author does not miss the opportunity to describe Padmavati's appearing to Krishna and Krishna's requesting for the image in the most elegant manner. And the description of the meeting goes this way. Padmavati, the deer of Dharnendra, then manifested on the third day of Krishna's penance. Krishna, by offering reverence at the feet of Padmavati, who appeared with a group of goddesses, through a way of reciting praise poem, thus said, O Pavane, O holy, I have felt contented. I feel grateful. O Devi, my wish has been fulfilled on seeing you. How do I praise your magnificence in my words? Even Indra is not even competent to praise you. The 18th century text Ratri Bhojan Pariharika Ras, poetry on abstaining from eating at night of Jinahansa Suri, consisting of 25 chapters, focusing on instruction on refraining oneself from eating during night hours. The text, written in Apabhramsha Gujarati language in the year 1702, not much is known about the author. However, he notes that he has composed the Rasa in Patan, a prominent center for Jainism in Gujarat. Jinaharsha Suri begins with a doha, a couplet, to offer a homage prayer. The author dedicates the homage prayer to the event of Padmavati's giving the Jina Parshvanath's image to Krishna. This mendicant author narrates the entire story in less than 6 lines, and it's beautifully written. This is perhaps the first attestation of the Gujarati, of the Padmavati narrative in the Gujarati or Apabhramsha language, other than Prakrit and Sanskrit, as we saw earlier. Now, during my field work in Gujarat among the Shwetambar Murti Pujak Jains, I engaged with the Jain devotees at various Jain temples across the state, and particularly at Shankheshwara and even Naroda in Ahmedabad, and so on and so forth, and particularly Bhattini Bari in Ahmedabad. These Jains share their devotion for Padmavati and her connection to Shankheshwar Parshvanath Tirtha. Gaudiji Parshvanath Jain Derasar, situated in Naroda village of Ahmedabad, and Jain temple in Bhattini Pol, or also known as Bhattini Bari, in the city of Ahmedabad, among other places. For today, my focus on the temples and their Sthala Purana, as discussed in the text of Jain Prabhu Suri and Dhaneshwar, as discussed earlier, but I would be happy to talk more about other temples during Q&A session. The Jain devotees' insights reflect how oral traditions, their narratives, and personal devotion reinforce the significance of both the temple and the goddess in the contemporary Jain practice. Taruben, a 62 years old female devotee, emphasized Padmavati's immense prabhav, like what she then translated herself as like spiritual power, in attracting pilgrims to Sankheshwara. For her, the presence of Padmavati is just as crucial as that of Parshvanath. As she believes the goddess actively responds to devotees' prayer, she describes how visiting the temple and having darshan of both the Jina and Padmavati bring her a sense of divine protection and spiritual fulfillment. And this all is in the context of that Padmavati was instrumental bringing the image to Gujarat, and that she belongs to Gujarat. Rakesh Bhai, a 38 years old male devotee, echoed the same sentiment, stating that Padmavati is more than a guardian deity. She is a motherly figure who nurtures devotee and intervenes in times of distress. He recounted on widely known story of Padmavati assisting Krishna in Gujarat by granting him the sacred image of Parshvanath. According to him, without Padmavati's intervention, the temple of Sankheshwara would not have existed at all. This belief, he asserted, is passed down orally, and he heard this also from his grandfather, ensuring that each generation remains connected to her divine presence in Gujarat. Mr. Bojak, a temple or a Bhakti singer at Sankheshwara temple in Sankheshwara town, highlighted how stavans, devotional hymns, continue to reinforce Padmavati's role. And when he meant stavans, it's more of songs rather than stavan, but he used the word stavan, so I have not changed that. Reinforce Padmavati's role in establishing this temple. He explained that many of the songs sung during the temple Bhakti sessions narrate Padmavati's most important role in the temple's history, strengthening the belief in her miraculous power. He shared that devotees not only listen to the stories, but also recount them within their families, keeping the oral tradition alive. And this oral tradition keeps on retelling that Padmavati belongs to Gujarat, and she is the instrumental to all this temple mentioned here. I find it important to mention a few elements of the ritual practices performed as a part of venerating the goddess, although it's not like very connected to my project right now. At the Sankheshwar temple, Padmavati is offered a sari, that is the Gujarati dress for women, or chundari, traditional Gujarati apparel for women, which can be purchased from the shops that sell items used for ritual worship near the temple. One can also bring a fresh sari or chundari from home as well. She is offered oil lamps, but no arati song sung to her in the temple. The practice of offering sari and chundari to a goddess is a part of larger popular ritual culture among Hindu goddess worship in Gujarat. And this is very similar to that. And a part of making her into a Gujarat's history and closer to the devotees is also making her like how goddesses are worshipped even in Hindu traditions. When positioned within the context of ritual, the offering of apparel is a part of venerating the goddess. However, when the act of offering the Gujarati style apparel to the Jain goddess is seen from a cultural angle, it gives Padmavati a significant regional identity as well. When I interacted, Jains I interacted with during the fieldwork have established an accessible relationship with the goddess. I could observe that imagining Padmavati in the localized history of Gujarat, of the Gujarati Jains, of course, along with placing her comfortably in the Jain universal history, is resulting in the devotees to interact with her and portray her as protecting Shakti, nurturing mother, and usually she's been called Mata or Madi or Ma, and these are the Gujarati colloquial words to address a mother. Mahadevi, a great goddess. A common theme across these perspectives is that the strong association of Padmavati with Gujarat, as lay Jains perceive her as an integral part of their understanding and collective memory of the region's localized Jain history.
Excuse me, I know you have about 2 minutes remaining.
Sure. Furthermore, the narratives surrounding the Sankheshwar Parshvanath Tirtha and Padmavati's role continue to be preserved and transmitted through 3 significant Gujarati texts. And many Jain devotees who I met with, they have read this or must have heard it from other people. And these 3 texts are Sankheshwar Mahatirth, written in 1941, Sankheshwar Mahatirth Chitravali, 1970, by Muniraj Jayanta Vijayji, whose picture I have taken, Sri Sankheshwar Parshvanath by Manilal Nyai Chand Shah. This text reinforces the sacredness of the site and Padmavati's divine intervention, ensuring that the story remains central to the religious consciousness of Jain devotees. This evolving narrative continues to circulate orally among the Jains in Gujarat, emphasizing Padmavati's role as a feminine divine. By maintaining and transferring these stories across generations, Jain communities have not only integrated her into their localized religious history, but have also heightened their devotion to her as goddess. I am pleased to, because this comes from my PhD dissertation project, and I hope to continue further into that. But I'm very pleased to acknowledge the inspiration that I have drawn from esteemed scholars such as Dr. Narayanan, Stephen Vose, who was in my dissertation committee, Christopher Key-Chapel, John Card, Robert Zeidenbus, and Whitney Kelting, among others, whose work on goddess traditions, devotional practices, and regional forms of Jainism has significantly influenced my research. So thank you very much, and I would wait for a question and answer.
All right. We have one sort of set of questions here in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A actually, and please do keep your questions coming if you have them. I'll just offer a few remarks here on each of the papers, sort of I think individually, and I think perhaps from that some of the larger themes will emerge here. But starting with Jean's paper, I really appreciate the way that we're sort of getting a full view of the wider world of Persianate, sort of the ecumene, the Persianate ecumene, if you will, of sort of the view of Jains. And I think it's one of the bigger holes or lacunae in Jain studies is sort of figuring out what to do with the sort of the writings that we have between really the 14th century up to the 19th century, in which we have all sorts of literature being produced in vernacular languages. We have things in Sanskrit, but it always feels like there's kind of a piece missing there. Certainly when sort of advising students about Megha work on yoga, it seems like we go from something like the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali all the way up to a big gap of who knows what happens, and then maybe Hemant Chandra, and then the next thing you know, we've got Megha. And in between, right, our field has sort of missed out on the fact that there was all of this writing about yoga and about Vedanta and about many other traditions in Persian. We have a large project of translating works from Sanskrit into Persian, and that there really is a Persianate ecumene involving not just Muslims and Muslim domination, but in fact, right, an operative world of right administration and bureaucracy and everything else. One of the things that I really liked about your paper, Jean, is that you're asking this question: where do all of these kind of stereotypes about Jains come from that appear in these Persian works? Is this the Kayastas, the sort of local intellectuals and scribes who are sort of translating things into Persian from their own experiences and sort of, yeah, the things that they hear around them? Yeah, I really appreciate the discussion of where certain ideas about caste, gotcha, things like that are starting to emerge in the Persian literature, and that there is a kind of an ethnographic sensibility that pops up at different times as an attempt to discuss who is sort of putting information out there. I'm really interested in James Skinner. I'd love to hear more about him. But certainly the idea of, right, when we get into European languages, we hear a lot about Banyas, sometimes about Shravakas, and right, that seems to speak for a wider group of caste communities who practice Jainism as well as other traditions, but seem to be unified more or less around a set of occupations, like mercantile activity. And it seems like there is, yeah, that sort of fluidity of reference going on back and forth between Jains, Banya castes, and these occupations. I was wondering if you might just say a little bit more about that. In terms of, yeah, sort of some of the other terminology that gets used to describe Jains, right? We have, right, Sivra, right, Jatis, and even I found the Samvegi reference really curious, as I think you did. Like, were they really encountering sort of wandering Shvetambara monks at this time, right? It seems like early 19th century was kind of a low point for sort of fully wandering monks? And is this more of a theoretical position than an actual one? Is a really great question for us to entertain as we're kind of careful with how we read these sources. And I really do appreciate the care with which you've treated these sources, right? Not because we are in some ways sort of forced to kind of extrapolate whom they must be talking about because they don't use the same terminology that we do to describe Jains per se, but rather by triangulating certain kinds of terminologies, certain kinds of practices, it seems like we're talking about Jains. Although, right, even when it comes to a term like Digambar, right, we have lots and lots of records of ascetics of various traditions who go naked, right? As Vijay Pinch has talked about when it comes to the military labor market, right? We've got Nath yogis, we've got others who sort of consider nakedness to be part of their practices. So yeah, I really appreciate the care with which you're taking to sort of parse out what these terms may and may not mean. Yeah, switching over to Venu's paper, and I think that what we're seeing in terms of encounter here is another one of those issues of sort of lacunae and emergence, sort of giving us a sense of both the localization of certain kinds of practices and also, in a way, sort of the reciprocal universalization. And I appreciate what you were saying toward the end about Padmavati as a Mahadevi within the Jain tradition. And I know that you made a few claims in your dissertation that you didn't quite talk about here about the possibility of devotion to Padmavati, possibly even delivering moksha to a devotee, and sort of how do we understand that within kind of the normative frameworks of Jainism? Is this something that is sort of beyond those frameworks, or right, are our frameworks kind of over-determinative of how we understand really what Jain devotion looks like? Right, and I think that so much of the work of John Court, Whitney Kelting, myself, and others about what Jain devotion really means in terms of the wider understanding of Jainism as essentially a path to moksha, right, sort of via asceticism. We often think of devotion in ways that sort of fit uncomfortably within the Jain world. And it seems like your paper is kind of wrestling with that very idea, right? Is Padmavati sort of external to the Jain ascetic path that has been captured in some way by Jains? Or is it really a much more intrinsic kind of argument in which devotion and the logic of devotion fosters the kind of proliferation of extra beings in the world who can help us out? Certainly, right, one of the things that I'd love to hear more about is Padmavati's status as a Naga. Right, we have kind of this class of beings who are there assisting many of us, right? And every tradition tries to capture the Nagas, right? Of course, we have the famous image of Buddha being sheltered by the multi-headed cobra that, right, of course, is much more sort of prevalent and common within the Jain devotional world of Parshvanath and even Suparshvanatha. I have to put in a plug for my guy. And so, right, what we see here is kind of a world in which the Jinna's connections with the Nagas is a really important one to maintain for that Jain world of association with yakshas and yakshis. And you do a pretty good job of showing us not just Padmavati, but Dharanendra, her sort of complement. And we see other ways that some of this devotional aspect has certain kinds of authority figures popping up over time, right? Jinaprabha Suri, Daneshwara Suri, even Abhayadeva are sort of the great sort of kind of medieval dark horse figure that every gacha tries to incorporate, successfully or less so. And even way up to, right, Jayanta Vijay and others. And so, right, this isn't just right, the sort of the popular elite distinction clearly doesn't seem to hold up here very well either in terms of who's actually producing knowledge about Padmavati. Yeah, and of course, right, fitting her into the universal history through the Krishna Jarasandha story and sort of localizing her in Shankeshwar is, of course, another one of these ways that we understand the sort of the popularization of a devotional style of religiosity that I think one of the things you do really well here is showing that like this isn't just sort of a kind of a riffing on Hindu devotion, right? That was sort of the thesis for a long time. And I think that as we do more research, as we take the claims of John Court and others seriously about how integral devotion really is to the Jain path, it's studies like this that really show us how integrated the logic of devotion already is into the Jain world well before, say, the revival of the so-called Bhakti movement in the 15th century onward. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts from reading your papers and listening to your presentations today. And I see we have a set of questions here in the chat. I don't know if Jean or Vanu, if you have any responses to some of the things that I was asking about, and then we'll switch over to the Q&A.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Steve, for these excellent questions. And for the question of why are these Persian sources depicting Jains in such a bad light? We really have to see that most of the Hindu Persian literature were Khatris or Kayastas. So this is a very, very localized voice in a way and it seems that it points out a competition between Jains and Khatris and scribal castes, one of which is clearly apparent in some of the texts around the status of the Kshatriya status, which was because some Jains were owning Rajput ascendancy in Rajasthan. So this would have been quite problematic for Kayastas and Khatris were themselves vying for this Kshatriya ascendancy. So I think this is one place where this might come from. So this is one thing. Or for the Banya and the fluidity, yes, between the crossovers between like the lay community being assimilated with Banyas, this is definitely something that we see in the Dabistan and Mazahib Banyas. Like most of lay followers are assumed to be Banyas, but it's not necessarily the case because, I mean, we still see the word Sravaka being used, Sravaka being used also to refer to them as being a layman, not just Banyas. But so from the mid-18th century in the Merathi Ahmadi, we see starting a real ethnography of Banya castes, of Vaishya castes, and with a very precise depiction of these, for example, Maheshwari merchants in these mixed groups that are combining both Vaishnava and Jaina devotees, and this is a very, very interesting, important source, and this is also something you'll find in the Tafsir al-Akfam by James Skinner. This precise description of different groups within the lay Jain community and their overlaps with the Vaishnava merchant communities. And for the Samvegi Maturanat, it's I have no idea of what these sources are, and this is always the problem. Is the only person who quotes their sources is James Skinner, where when they just mentioned that they actually had an interview with a certain monk, and they give their name. But apart from that, it's quite impossible to determine, and this goes for most of the descriptions of also other Hindu sects. So in the case of Samvegi, it's just out there. It's mentioned by Maturanat, and I can't really say much more about that. And yes, it's just part of the earlier mentions in 19th century. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Venu?
Yeah, sure. So I'll go with the Naga thing. To respond to this question, this comment, I'll start with the ethnography stuff. The Jains that I interacted with, they really minimized she being a Naga Yakshi or the Naga goddess. I think what is happening with the Jains in Gujarat that I particularly studied is that they want to see her as a very classical elite goddess, which is completely like, and I again would say that, and this is going on the trail of John Cott, you and Whitney Kelting, that because the Jains have the devotional culture with them, their own very distinctive, but at the same time, they share Gujarati cultures with the Hindus living in Gujarat. So for most of the Jains, Padmavati's Naga connection or Nag connection, and she being, having the embodiment of Naga in her iconography as part of her representation, is more like how Magar crocodile is with Kodiyar. So that's how they see her. But then this connects, and of course, and I was really happy to read Daki Saheb's Parshva Dharendra Nexus, and I was like, Daki Saheb, why not Padmavati in the book? Why did you miss her? But anyways, but that book has more of like why Naga's connection to, and because from the Dharna's perspective, but Dr. Vose, you would remember my paper on Padmavati's iconography, and of course, Padmavati came to me because of Dr. Vose. So again, a big thanks to him. So that would be a more way. And in Gujarat's representation of Padmavati, the Kurkut Sarpa is not only just one, but as I mentioned, it's always even the lotus. So as I said, like they are also changing the way they see her and portray her. But that is a very interesting point, and I would elaborate if I would work on the manuscript later. And now about the liberation, moksha, that Padmavati can bring moksha if she can. And this is how, so I was really fascinated with Harsha Sagar's, who is like 16th century poet who writes the way how the Barots would write for the goddesses in Gujarati literature, right? The Charani literature, that's how the style is. And it's not about they are borrowing each other's styles. They use the same apparatus, the cultural, literary apparatus that were prevailing in Gujarat for long. And there he says that whatever desire, so you reside in the liberation. That's what she says, that tu mokshma rahe che, you reside in the liberation. So there, not only this authors starting from, let's say, 11th century till until now in contemporary time, neither Jain lay people will anytime would say that she will help bring liberation, but the way they construct connection between liberation and devotion to Padmavati is this way, that first they have constructed and established and understood that Padmavati is a pure, classical, very virtuous, noble Jain goddess who herself is so pure that she always inspires and guides to liberation, unlike just being a Sashan Devata who protects. So she is the first one to do that. And if we have devotion to her, if we see her as the goddess, definitely the liberation is going to come. It is complicated and complex. Many Jains, several response can explain it in a composite, in a complete way, but this is like a nutshell. And so yeah, I guess I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. So yeah.
Thank you for that. We have two questions in the chat here, or sort of two sets of questions here. I think I'll go in reverse order here just to give Venu the first crack at this here. Shailene Jain writes, thanks to both presenters for a fascinating presentation. I just have a query for Dr. Venu Mehta. The provincialization or regionalization of Padmavati is a strong reflection of the shifting form of devotion from textual to oral tradition. Agency of the author, namely textual, and performer, oral. Certainly, orality made devotion to the goddess more palpable, but then does it compromise the sort of imagery sketched in the textual tradition, and to what extent?
Oh, thank you. This is a great question, Shalinji. So there are two textual traditions, as I see here with Padmavati, the Prakrit, the Sanskrit, or the very Jain classical primary materials, such as like how it is, and we sometimes think that the yakshas are not referred in very early texts. They are, they come. Even the Digambara text from 4th to 5th century, they have Padmavatis and all these people, and they are described very well. But in terms of like how Padmavati is described in textual traditions such as only Shashana Devita or Yakshi is definitely changed in the textual traditions of the Jain mendicant authors coming from Gujarat, whether it is Jinaprabhasuri or no, definitely he maintains that, and Dr. Vose's dissertation is the best example for that. But then they also the change happens when the Jains in the contemporary time or the later period than Jaina Prabhusari, such as Pandit Vir Vijayji, and so on and so forth. The way they take it and changes that, her portrayal in the sense of Yakshi remains there, but then it's not only just Yakshi. Then she is goddess. She is Bhagwati. Bhagwati is the word that Gujaratis would use for Padmavati. They wouldn't say like Padmavati at all. It's Bhagwati only. And then you know that Bhagwati is Padmavati in Gujarat. So what so it's not about collective memory theory here or collective memory of religious group or community. It's more about even starts with construction or reconstruction, specifically deciding what to use and what not to use, what to include and not to include, in addition to create new. So, but and sometimes it appears that they are changing a little bit of into theological understanding between how Jinnah's worship versus Padmavati's worship. It appears that way, but then the very sweet devotional touch by the Jains will make us convinced that what they are doing is fine.
Thank you for that, Venu. Yeah, I also wonder if there's a hole in our history a little bit of the presence of, say, the Pashupatas and Nath Yogis, especially around Girnar, that David White has written a little bit about, that has actually created a kind of a presence of what we'd think of as tantric goddesses in the region, who are otherwise kind of brought into, right, the kind of the devotional mode. And so I'm wondering if there's sort of another history to be worked out here of that great hole of time in which we have so much and so little, that is the Solanki or Chalukya period. Yeah.
That would be the
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to add one thing. So when I started working on Padmavati's Gujarat connection and how the Jains are establishing her with Gujarat, if we compare it with Amba, like, right, Ambika, the Yakshi Ambikas, and how she's been like with the Hindu Amba and all that, and her Girnar's connection, Shatrunjay's connection, how she's protecting. I think the Jains are really doing something different with Padmavati than they have done with Ambika. She remains with one place, one sacred place, and one something. And Padmavati is like everywhere. So it's more in an even sophisticated way. So how we call it in a lay language, sophisticated way. So
Excellent. Cool. All right. Claire Mays writes for Jean. Thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting. I have the following questions, and there's sort of three sets here. Did I understand correctly that some Persian sources describing Jains are written in a doxographic style, while others follow an ethnographic approach? Regarding the Persian doxographies, do they differ significantly from Sanskrit doxographies in how they depict Jains? Or do they share similarities, suggesting that Persian doxographies might be continuing the tradition of Sanskrit doxographies? All right, should I pause there or just read them all?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right, second question, or set of questions. Could you elaborate on the type of hostile relationship between Jains and Brahmins you mentioned in the Persian texts? And then the final one is, do any Persian sources refer to the Jain practice of salekana, or fasting to death? If not, do you think its absence is comparable to the lack of references to naked Digambara monks? In other words, could it indicate that the practice was not prevalent at the time? Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I think great questions there. Yeah, the first question on the doxography was obviously something that nagged me, or like in order to try and understand why the specific texts were starting to exist in the Persian tradition. And so I have several answers to this. It's not totally clear to me. So if we just take the example of Abul Fazl and Ani Akbari, is more clearly following the example of doxography, and is more focusing on actually description of religious concepts more than describing actual communities. So it doesn't have a lot of, let's say, field work or attachment to describing how the actual. So he doesn't mention meeting any of the monks, even though he met with them. But these are more religious debates that they have at the court. In the later period, starting with Mubad, we really see that there is a reference to information being taken from the ground. So Zoroastrian author Mubad in the 18th century. In this, the format is different here because Mubad is more in an Islamic format of describing different religious groups. So in Dabestani Mazahib is more of a take on the Milal Nunihal Bash, which is an earlier Islamic doxographical heresiography, also it could be called, but a doxographical work. So there's clearly a sort of conflict between the two models, the Islamicate and the Indic, and about the Darshana model, and you have a few references to the Shad Darshana in the Persian sources, but it's interesting because it doesn't really look like it's the Shad Darshana that we now see as the canonic one. With the the listing obviously was varying between the different Sanskrit texts, but it's more of a vague reference to whatever religious groups were existing in North India in the same way it's being used in Sant literature. So this is another take on doxography more of as a trope, like the idea of the Shadarshana being more like a trope than actual reference to the text themselves of the Sanskrit tradition. And yeah, moving forward, it's becoming more and more centered about classifying groups, which is more of an I would say ethnographic. You don't have much that in the Abul Fazl, how these different groups can be divided, classified, and what are their specific characteristics. So this is moving on towards the early 19th century and culminating with the James Skinner in 1825. So yeah, my answer is I'm not totally sure because the sources are unclear to me in many cases, but even though we don't know before about Abul Fazl, he's really reflecting the more the doxographical Sanskrit tradition, even though we didn't have access necessarily to the Sanskrit texts themselves, but via probably discussions at the court of Akbar. For the hostility, so other examples are mainly focusing. So there is filth is something that is clearly mentioned quite often in the Persian sources. So monks are supposed to be filthy, and this comes in relation to the imperative of not causing any harm to living beings, which, I mean, obviously has consequences in terms of washing ritual, regulation around washing and certain things like this that are reinterpreted as a proof of filth of Jain monks. So this is something that appears quite often. And for the magic, it's ambiguous because it's as much as they can be powerful to occult scientists or practitioner of higher spiritual caliber, they also are depicted as magicians, which is obviously not a very good the word being used in Persian. Sahiri or jadugari is not a very good term and is not meant as a positive trait. And yeah, I hope I am answering this with partially. I mean, I would have more things to answer, but like right now, I don't have anything coming to my mind. And the Salikana, yes, no, it's not mentioned at all. So indeed, that's a good suggestion. Might be the same thing as with the naked munis. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both very much, Venu and Jean. A big round of applause for them, virtual or otherwise. And now I believe we'll hand it back over to Tine for a vote of thanks.
feel free to do so. And I will hand it back over to Chris, who's just going to take 1 more minute of your time to talk you through the next session in our series. But also from my part, thank you to all 3 of our wonderful speakers today for making this such an interesting session. Chris, it's you.
All right, let's see. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve, Sean, and Venu very much for your wonderful presentations, and Steve for emceeing for us. Our next event in the Dialogues in European Jain Studies speaker series will be on April 14th, and it will be at 8 a.m. Pacific next time, not 9 a.m. Same time here, though, 5:30, or excuse me, 5 o'clock in Europe. I've posted the link to register for that inside of the chat, and that will be presided by our very own Tine Wekemans. And we will also have Professor Jonathan Dickstein from Arihanta Institute and Joey Tumanello. We look forward to seeing you then. We hope you'll register and join us for this next event in the Dialogues in European Jain Studies. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day, afternoon, or evening. Jai Jinendra. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.